Bit about securing the vote. And I know that I've really harped on voting and there's a lot of things that can go wrong with voting, but now there are some things you can do that as you're building this company to kind of think about what you want to do when you're getting ready to do that voting. This is the linchpin to how your DAO is controlled. Everything that your DAO does is controlled through voting. And because of that, this is probably beyond what the DAO actually does, is the next most important thing in that checklist of things to do when you're working through a DAO and you're building your first DAO. And the first thing you want to do is make sure that the vote has integrity and that the voting outcome is trustworthy. Without those two things, the whole process gets to be called into question. And if it's not done in a fair and transparent manner, if it undermines the trust of the people who actually vote, people will stop voting. People will stop believing in the DAO. Now, voting is basically a trust mechanism. Some people are never going to trust. Some people are never going to believe that the voting actually happens or is a good thing, right? There's always that outlier on that one. But the thing is that you can do certain steps to make sure that the voting system for your DAO has got that integrity and trustworthy. You can educate your participants about their role. Now, remember, if you are a voting member of a DAO, you're essentially the board. You're making decisions for the company. You are a board member. Some people may not make that connection. They just think, oh, I'm just going to vote, or I don't care, or whatever about the DAO. But the point is, if you are a voting member of a DAO, you are a board member of that DAO. What you say and how you vote matters to the overall operation. And that is a new education paradigm for people to think about. They often think their vote doesn't matter, or that who cares if I vote or don't vote. We have really low participation and turnout when it comes to voting, and a small subset of people can have an outsized influence on the outcome of a vote. So make sure that you are educating people about where the vote matters and why it matters, what the threats are, right? And someone may come up and say, hey, would you be interested in this amount of money if you vote this way on this DAO? It could happen. Just make sure that they're aware of it, right? And make sure that the risk of malicious actors is basically minimized, because there are going to be people that try to manipulate others to vote in a particular way. We're dealing with people here, and people are messy, right? But you just want to make sure that as you're going through and checking all this stuff and building the rules around voting, that decisions are made in a fair and transparent manner. And this is what's going to build trust, and this is what's going to maintain the integrity of the voting process. And this is where people are going to start believing in the DAO and understanding their responsibility as a board member for this program, whatever it is. Now, you're going to utilize the blockchain. The big reason to do that is that immutability and transparency, and you want to make sure votes are recorded and stored in tamper-resistant manner. Now, utilizing the blockchain is expensive if you do every vote on this. There are other systems out there now that exist, like the Quantum Ledger database in AWS, that provides you that same tamper-resistant auditable feature, but without costing as much money as the blockchain. So what you could do is gather all your votes in that Quantum Ledger database out in AWS. And no, I'm not making an endorsement here. It's just a technology, right? Store it there, then put a link or a pointer to that result set inside the blockchain. That way you have that transparency back and forth. People can bring up the data. And again, there's other technologies out there, because you really just want to make sure that everything is stored as tamper resistant. And the blockchain is one way of doing it, but there's other technologies now that can really help out when it comes to that. The other one is using smart contracts for the vote. I would actually not use the same smart contracts I use for my DAO's business to do the voting. Those would be two separate mechanisms for me in the way I would put this thing together, right? But I would use smart contracts for the vote, because then all that stuff becomes automated. But are you going to write your own smart contract for the vote, or are you going to use third party? Now, I'm going to recommend third party, right? And the big reason for that is because they're going to meet that criteria of audited, secure, and as free from vulnerabilities as possible. If you write your own voting mechanism, you have to understand how voting works. If you're using something like OpenZeppelin or Consensus or someone else that has a business reason to be writing contracts for voting, this actually makes more sense. You can probably get them to customize a little bit if you want to use something like the Quantum Ledger or something else. And then you transfer that risk onto Open Zeppelin, or whoever you use. So when you're dealing with risk and you're dealing with risk management, transfer of risk from your LLC, your DAO, to another company is perfectly acceptable, right? It's actually a really good way of managing risk. The other one is good, strong authentication, right? Make sure that as much as you can, identity of the voters is pretty kind of important, because you don't want someone just hacking their way into the system and pretending to be someone else with a big voting block. And you can use MFA, you can use cryptology, you can use integration with things like Azure or Google or Facebook logins. There's a lot of ways of doing this, and you can do multiple hurdles. Right now, especially if you're guarding something important, it's something you know, something you have, and something you are, right? And the only problem is with biometrics is they're complicated and they're really weird to use. If you have to provide technology to your voters, that's one thing to do, but it's an extra cost. The other one too is deploy mechanisms to prevent Sybil attacks. Because we've known about this all the way back to Bitcoin startup days, right? And this is not a hard thing to do. Right, what you really want to do is make sure that if you have someone that's getting close to 51%, that's noted, and that you put into techniques that will stop that kind of thing. So your proof of stake, proof of authority, your consensus mechanisms, reputation-based systems, all of the things that you would use to mitigate a Sybil attack can absolutely be used here. And again, it all is going to center around how voting blocks are actually formed. And these things may come and go over time. You just want to be aware that if someone's getting to around 40% as a single voting block, that you start noticing that and you start taking appropriate steps to kind of break that up a little bit. Then, of course, standards, encryption, privacy, sensitive voting information. Again, just encrypt your database if you're using QLDB and there's privacy involved, and that's one way of doing it, is just encrypt the whole thing. You're fine. If it's on the blockchain, it's transparent. So you're really not going to have a lot of privacy around the actual voting process, and it'd be easy to pull out the voting data from the actual blockchain itself, right? But you may have sensitive voting information, because if I know how this beautifully done asset class or this beautifully done venture capitalist that's a VC and how they're embedding and voting and putting money in the blockchain, I can pull that data out and I can do and find out how they're putting money into systems. And then I can follow up on my own without having to be a venture capitalist. It's actually pretty cool. Testing and audit, definitely. Always do security audits. This is one of those things you should really watch for. This is a high value asset, right? And I would use a third party as well as my own. So again, just pretty standard business kind of stuff here. No real big surprise on this one, right? Testing and audit is a big part of just regular company operation, and you are a company as a DAO. The other one that's kind of cool too is public transparency, public results. I love voting dashboards. I love voting web pages so that people can just go in and take a look and see how the voting actually happened, if it is in alignment with where the DAO is. If the DAO is an investor, I don't want to have a public dashboard. Most of the VC DAOs don't have public dashboards. They just have data that you'd have to go pull and make a dashboard the other way. But you do want to make sure that people who are voting actually see how everything was done, how the votes were cast, how what tallying was done, and then make sure that there's independent verification if someone challenges the vote. Monitoring, always, right? If there's something weird going on, make sure you see it. Make sure if it's anomalous behavior that you see it. This can include looking for irregular voting patterns, network activity, attempts at manipulating the voting process, or even just someone that's getting to 51% of the quorum amount. There's a lot of things to kind of watch out for. The other one that's really kind of cool is that this should really have its own governance and oversight, right? You can go ahead and create that community governance and participation for checks and balances, but encourage community members to report anything weird that's going on. So if someone comes up and asks them, say, hey, can I bribe you? That they report it to the owner or to the DAO that, hey, I had this bribery attempt, right? And again, there's a lot of trust there, but if you have suspicious activities, make sure there's a reporting mechanism for that, even if it's anonymous. And then again, educate. Give guidelines and resources to help people to protect their accounts and make sure that there's responsible voting behavior. So there's a lot of stuff here to secure the DAO vote. And again, and when you're a company, that vote matters, and that vote tells the company how it's going to operate. So you want that voting to be as secure as possible. What's in this list is basically a minimum standard, right? These are the minimal amount of things you should do to help secure the voting process. And that's kind of where we're going to go with this. There's a lot of neat things to do, and there's probably more here. This is the minimum. Okay, I will see you in the next lecture.